Welcome everyone to this webinar, which I'm really excited about. It's our fact and fiction webinar that celebrates the authors who've written and published books in a cultural climate that's hostile to facts and reality and insistent on their replacement with a fiction, namely the idea of gender identity in place of the reality of sex. And the authors I'll be talking to today have written what I would call ordinary books. By that, I don't mean they're ordinary writers. I think they're all extraordinary. Absolute top quality thinkers, philosophers, teachers, poets, clinical professionals, academics. It's a stellar cast, and I'm very honoured that all agreed to talk to me today in support of Transgender Trend at this fundraising event. And what I do mean is that even 10 years ago, none of these books would have been remarked on in terms of subject matter. Writers of books were allowed to question ideologies, write critiques of ideas, author positive picture books for children, or books for professionals on therapeutic disciplines. But today, in a cultural climate where it's heresy to define a woman as an adult human female, to even write a book about menstruation for girls becomes a subversive act, let alone books that critique the idea of gender identity or challenge the medical treatment of children. The subject of this webinar is very close to my heart. I love books. Books are my passion. I could spend a whole day in a bookshop browsing. When I buy a new book, I smell the pages. I love that books are real objects in the real world, that they can be taken places, passed on, given as gifts. I love the power of books to change the world. In a totalitarian regime, books are the first thing to be banned. Back in 2018, I crowdfunded to get the Transgender Trend Schools Guidance printed for this very reason. I wanted parents to have something to take into schools, an actual booklet, to be able to hand it over to the teachers and say, here's an alternative, please read it. There was an outcry from transgender activist groups when I got the schools guidance printed and with calls to ban it, bin it, shred it, which I think says a lot more about them than it does about me or the content of the schools guidance. So publication of alternatives was one of my main aims when I set up Transgender Trend, one of my main commitments in the work that I do. And we've produced 4 booklets addressing school policies, including an analysis of external providers of sex and relationships education, which is a hot topic. So we have the initial schools guide in its 3rd edition, inclusive relationships and sex education, safeguarding concerns, and a children's rights impact assessment. We also produced, we have this expert analysis of YouTube videos that hundreds of thousands of teenage girls are watching online. And I think this is also a really useful booklet to take into your child's school to show this kind of social contagion that's happening with teenage girls online. We've also produced, or we print and distribute, this really beautiful booklet, Gender Detransition, from a group called Post Trans, a detransition support group, beautifully illustrated and a really useful guide. And again, that's something that parents could take into schools. And it really cheers me that all of these publications are out there in the world doing their work. And I still get feedback from parents who took the guide into their school 3 years ago. And then I get feedback saying how much it's been valued at the school and is being used. And I love that fact. It cheers me when I think things are going wrong, or it's all sort of a bit overwhelming. I think, well, out in the world that's happening, and it's the power of these booklets that's doing that without me having to do any extra work. The authors here today have been aware all of the censorious strictures on freedom of belief and speech in this area, but have gone ahead and published anyway. They are the pioneers who've made the path easier for those who follow. Because of their work and their courage, more writers will take the plunge and dare to publish books that challenge the prevailing dogma of gender identity. Publishers will get braver as they realise there's a big market and demand for these books as more and more people wake up to the damage gender identity ideology is causing throughout society. So this webinar, I see it as charting a development of a movement through the books that were published during its course. It takes you through the first books to challenge the social and medical transition of children, books published for children, books published for clinical professionals, and books written for a wider general public. And I'm very honoured to begin with the pioneers who were first to publish books that challenged the social and medical treatment of children. Michele Moore and Heather Brunskell-Evans edited 2 volumes of essays by academics, parents, detransitioners, clinicians, and others, and managed to get them published at a time when publishers were all scrambling to get their first transgender title on their books. Cambridge scholars, however, did agree to publish Transgender Children and Young People Born in Your Own Body in 2017, followed by the invention of transgender children and young people in 2019. So I'm thrilled to introduce to you Heather Brunskell-Evans, who's a sociologist and philosopher of medicine. She's a key figure in academia who's analysed and challenged the claims of queer theory and the social construction of the transgender child. Michele Moore has worked on the agenda for inclusion and inclusive education for over 30 years. She's editor-in-chief of the world-leading journal Disability and Society. And Michele's probably most famous for her Woman's Place video, which has got far and away the greatest number of hits ever for a Woman's Place video. It's over 40,000 now. And rightly so. It's if you haven't seen it, please do watch it. So thank you very much for joining us in this webinar, Heather and Michele. And I'm going to be asking each of you the same 3 questions, really. And I'm going to start with you, Heather, with a very simple question. What made you think it was important to publish that first book back in 2017, Transgender Children and Young People Born in Your Own Body? Why was that important to you?
Definitely, in order to answer the question, I need to go back to something that happened to me in 2015 when I wrote an article about Bruce Jenner, and a strange thing happened, which had never happened to me before in academia, is that someone made a complaint to the Vice Chancellor about this short essay that I wrote. His name was Natasha Kennedy, also goes by the name of Mark Helen, and strangely at that time was writing in both names without any sanction at all from his university, which was Goldsmiths. His claim was that I had breached the 2010 Equality Act, that I would make students and staff at my university feel very unsafe, and that in fact the implication was that I should lose my job. And at that time, I have to say that I was absolutely petrified, and that sadly I didn't know, I hadn't really taken much notice of the Equality Act 2010. So for about 48 hours, I was absolutely petrified that something terrible would happen to me and I would lose my job. The article that I wrote went off to the university's lawyers, and it came back, and I was fully endorsed by the University of Leicester in writing it. But that incident planted something very serious in my head. And the first thing was that the fiction of a man who identifies as a woman had so much power over me at that time to possibly silence me, for the university to take such a person seriously, and that I would be sanctioned, frightened me for various reasons. One, for liberal democracy and the power of a man who just identifies as a woman to say he's a woman, and that for society to assumed that he was a woman. So I got into it that way. The second thing, if I can try to explain this, is that a very dear friend of mine, a few months later, I parked that on the shelf to think and worry about it. The second was a very dear friend of mine walked into my kitchen extremely upset, telling me that her daughter, who I'd known from birth, who was not assigned at birth, she was female, came and said that her daughter wanted to transition as a boy, experienced herself as being male, and that she herself was afraid to challenge this. Of course, I was encouraging her not to endorse this perception that her daughter had, because teenagers go through all kinds of different stages, and that but that she would be regarded as the person who was abusing her child if she didn't go along with it, if she didn't change the child's pronouns, if she didn't change the child's names, and affirm that her daughter was now male. So this confluence of events made me realize that this something really serious was happening in society in general, to children in particular, and that where I was frightened the first time to, or I was confused about how I should respond to this, I got this immediate feeling inside me, I'm going to act on this. I cannot remain silent.
So your experience was like sort of in the adult world, what's happening in wider society, and with children, you had a double whammy, both those things.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm.
And the fiction that one could change sex, I then started to pursue that, and so on and so forth. That's another issue. Yeah.
And Michele, what was your pathway to getting you two getting together to say we need to write a book?
Well, we were already together. We'd already been writing about frightening things. But for me, there was a similar realization during 2014, 2015, that we'd reached a kind of critical cultural moment in relation to these topics. And it happened in the same way that Heather described, through a combination of things that were in my job in the academy and the university, but also right in my own front room. So I had my own teenage daughter come home. I'll just give a couple of examples, demanding to borrow my credit card because she wanted to order a binder for a girl in her class. And I thought a binder was something you put your GCSE notes in. So I said to her, well, why can't her mummy buy her a binder? And then in the whole ensuing explanations that tumbled out, I was told that her friend's mum couldn't ever know about the binder, what the binder actually was, that it would have to be delivered to my house in secret, or her friend would commit suicide and this would be all my fault, and all kinds of red flags were flashing in my mind at that time. And then a few months later, my niece in a sixth form for girls was involved in a 2-day session about another girl who was going to transition as a boy. And my niece was shamed, to her great distress, by her teachers and by the trainer in this session, because she had asked, how can we help this girl if a little while later she actually changes her mind? And this question was thought to be heretical. So these things were happening in my real life, but also in work, because I was a professor of inclusive education. Parents were contacting me, telling me things that were happening to their children in school. And eventually a very well-known example now of a father who discovered that his daughter had been re-registered as his son by a school in Yorkshire. So I really realised that a very serious conversation had to be started about these issues. But when I started commenting, very quickly, junior colleagues started writing to me, saying that they would seek to disrupt my work and career if I didn't start to comply publicly with transgender ideology. In 2015, they started to threaten to specifically jeopardise my editorship of the journal Disability and Society, which I edit. And all these things convinced me that we needed a conversation. It had to be scholarly, had to involve the full range of stakeholders, parents, transsexual people, detransitioners, as well as academics and clinicians. And so Heather and I organised a secret meeting of people that we could get together to discuss these things. Lisa Marciano came over from America, and Kerry Callahan, the first BEM transitioner to go into this kind of print. And on the 15th of July, I'll never forget, 2016, the group of us agreed that we would bring about a book, but more sensationally than that, that as many of us as possible would write in our real names. And that was a huge moment.
I remember that. So I was invited to that meeting, but I was speaking at the event that Julia Long put on in London. So you all came down to be with me instead. Thank you. I met Lisa and Kerry Callahan, who was really a really prominent detransitioner who was writing at that time. So this is going back quite a bit, but it shows you, doesn't it, how long this has been going on in school. It's sort of hitting the news over the last year or so, but people don't realise how long it's been embedded in some schools across the UK. So you were both sort of silenced right from the start as soon as you started speaking, and were also aware of how that sort of silencing operates in society, in schools and in wider society. But that didn't stop you. It didn't silence you. You still were, in fact, were you more committed to the importance of publishing your book? Did it make you more motivated or see the need more to publish your book? Heather?
Well, there were various processes involved. With the first book, Transgender Children and Young People Born in Your Own Body, Michele and I, who worked together in the Middle East, in fact, on other academic projects, we were very committed to writing the book, but didn't know what the reception to it would be. We were aware that the contributors and that the wider society was very scared about speaking about this topic, which was such a red flag that really made me determined, in fact, to speak out. Because if somebody says to me, you can't do that, you can't say that, my feeling is that's the very thing that I should be saying. Then what actually happened was that after the first book was published, there was such a volatile and febrile response to a book that was arguing that children should be protected, that children go through developmental stages, that and so on and so forth. All the kinds of things that you were saying, Stephanie, that 5 years earlier, or would have been perfectly accepted as uncontroversial. Suddenly this was extremely controversial, and it was controversial across the board, not just in relation to children, but in relation to what one can say about biological sex. So the consequence for me was quite dramatic after the first publication, and that was that I was invited to talk on the Moral Maze about the ethics of transgendering children. And that in itself was a strange learning experience for me, because what actually happened was that the panel, after having various witnesses, including Jane Fay, who is a man who identified as a woman, began to, in very late middle age, and is a father, we were juxtaposed against one another, and the panel came out in favor of Fay. Now, Fay made the argument that there is no difference between giving children, teenage girls, the contraceptive pill, i.e. giving them female hormones, to giving those same girls cross-sex hormones. And the panel, allegedly, educated, thoughtful, critical thinking people, absolutely went along with this. And what that taught me, in fact, was that evidence goes out of the window, and what had come in was the phenomenon of the victim the poor trans person and the relationship between, if you identify as trans, you somehow know the truth about this. You can expect and actually receive lots of credibility for whatever it is that you say is truth. So now I began to realize I was absolutely in the world of fiction rather than fact, Orwellian almost. And of course, then what happened was that effectively I was, had an awful experience with the Women's Equality Party, who interrogated me for a number of months, you know, every tweet I'd ever written, everything I'd ever written, put me under investigation, and eventually took the position that I had at that time, which was quite a central position in the Women's Equality Party, off me on the basis that my ethics were problematical, not theirs. And that this actually came about on the say-so of one man, again, late middle-aged man, who identified as female, who had made the complaint about me on the basis of what I said on the Moral Maze. His name is Tony Harrison, and he called me a Nazi in public and so on. I mean, the story is now familiar, but at the time it was quite unique and quite shocking. So that was just, you know, and then subsequently I had to have security guards when I taught in my university for my own protection. And I could enumerate so many different instances of what felt like I'd emerged into a society which was completely turned upside down, so different to the one that I believed at that time that I was living in, which was a liberal democracy where reason counted, and that, you know, public media would be, such as the BBC, for example, would give people like me a further voice, which they didn't. They started to silence. But to finish off, I'd like to just tell the viewers that, in fact, I now regard myself as quite different from the person I was in 2015. There's a pre-2015 me and a post-2015 me. So I've learned so much about how society functions and how, in fact, totalitarian states could have emerged in the past, because ideology gets a grip of reasonable people. Yeah.
And Michele, how was the reaction to the book and your part in it? How was that for you? How did that affect you?
It was quite astonishing. There was I was instantly being deplatformed and having my honorary positions and my real positions threatened. We had a vexatious campaign to take down with Amazon of vexatious reviews. There was bullying and harassment everywhere. But two astonishing things happened. One was that people from the Tavistock Institute got in touch with us about the book.
This was the second book.
The first book. The first book.
We
got in touch because they got in touch with us about the first book because they weren't in it, and this was very interesting and led to all sorts of things. But also parents from around the world and detransitioners from around the world got in touch as well and wanted us to start to kind of mobilise their collective resistance as well. Heather, do you want to talk about the Tavistock response?
Let's just to say that was the first book.
Yeah.
And what interests me is that your response to all of the attempts to silence you was wonderfully to produce a second book, which I love. But I think it's the story of the Tavistock with the second book, which was inventing transgender children and young people, which was published in 2019. Do you want to talk about the Tavistock's reaction to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it had been very interesting because our colleagues from the Tavistock had approached us after the first book talking about their concerns, and we realised that whereas we had thought that they were colluding with the whole business because they hadn't been speaking out in public, that they very much were not, and they wanted to speak out in public, and we were in a position to bring that story of the disarray at the Tavistock out. this impelled us to write the second book that, together with the response from parents all over the world and detransitioners all over the world to the first book. So we went back to our contributors of the first book and spoke about this, and they very bravely agreed that they too wanted to have another go. We felt emboldened actually by the resistance, and so we put together another group of contributors with new detransitioners, more speaking out, and the second book was about to come out, but then we got a letter from the Tavistock, which Heather is going to talk about.
Yes, so our realization that what was going on at the Tavistock at that time was really shocking, that clinicians themselves didn't feel that they could speak out, that we met in secret with clinicians, we promised that we would never reveal who they were. So having realized that the Tavistock was in complete disarray and that people imagined that because it was the Tavistock, it must be doing something objective. And because of course medicine isn't never objective in that way, impelled us to write the second book. It was the spur actually. Then what happened was the Tavistock got wind of the fact that a second book was about to be published. And Michele and I at this point became very frightened, and I'd like to read out something from the letter from the solicitors that the Tavistock had employed. So we got various correspondence from these people, and I'd like to read out a sentence. This letter gives fair warning of what potential consequences may follow if you continue to decline to engage with our client, i.e. the Tavistock, in a cooperative fashion. So basically what they had wanted was for us to give them a copy of the second book before it was printed so that they could check whether they were happy with it going ahead. So this left the publishers, Cambridge scholars, in an absolute dilemma. They'd never had such a thing before, and they were naive about it. They were encouraging us to give this book to the Tavistock, and Michele and I were saying things like, but this is like asking the fox to take care of the chicken coop. We must not give this book to them. And at the same time, Michele and I think I can speak for Michele here, we were petrified. If a legal battle ensued, we had no money. I was absolutely petrified that the roof over my head would be taken away from me. I'd have to sell my house. And it went on for weeks. Of course, eventually the publishers, thank goodness, all praise to them, went with us in the end. And the result is the publication of the second book. And the Tavistock went completely quiet, because of course there's nothing that there was no legal case to be brought against it. But you must remember at this time, the Tavistock was really riding high. It was the very, if I may say, I think our books were the very first time that they'd had any criticism in public, and they had a sort of hubris about themselves, that they were untouchable. A little bit worried, that they were obviously worried about us, but, and you know, of course, what's happened since then, the Tavistock itself has been put under the spotlight, and I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud that Michele and I contributed to that, and if I may say, initiated some of that scrutiny that the Tavistock is under.
We were fortunate then to have allies. A barrister and a solicitor came forward to work for us pro bono, to help to the publishers to regain confidence in the possibility of bringing out the book, and the contributors who stood with us, because they were as frightened as we were that actually we were all putting our houses on the line if this really went badly. So it was a terrifying period during which the campaigns against us were escalating. The threats that had been made to me in 2015 really put me in the eye of the storm with a campaign against my journal editorship. My job was on the line. So yeah, it was a very difficult process to bring out that second book, but it's been very powerful.
I remember it as a contributor. I think it went on for months. You were emailing and saying, hold on. I don't think I was aware at the time of the enormous amount of stress and fear that you were both in at that time. But it's very frightening to get a legal letter and have legal threats. And quite unbelievable for me to look back now and think that, well, I felt it was at the time, but given what's emerged about the Tavistock, the fact that they tried to censor or, have control over other people's perspectives on the issue. And I think I'm right in saying that you were the first really to give detransitioners a sort of published voice in a book. I think that's a big part of what you did. And we've talked about the sort of negative reactions to the book, but also I want to just look at the positive things that happened, because I think it was the book that got the Karolinska Clinic parents in touch with you, and you began work with that group of parents. Can you tell us something about that? Because this is work that people don't know that you've done, and I think you deserve credit for it. So in Sweden, Swedish parents.
After the first book came out, Swedish parents and Karolinska Institute providers who had got together with some detransitioners from Norway and Finland contacted us and asked for our help in mobilising a campaign against what was happening in their countries. We did. We went and we helped them set up their own organisation, which is their equivalent of Transgender Trend. And they have, as you know, had great success with their campaigning. And we were very proud to be part of that. And the two young transitioners that came to our first meetings in Stockholm, they undertook to try to bring together the very first network of detransitioners who up until that point had been scared to even talk to each other. And they did that, as well as find the confidence somehow to write for our second book.
And it's amazing what you see has happened in Sweden since then, where they've changed their guidelines, and it shows the enormous power, I think, of having that public debate that you really started, and the power of parents. And so I'd just like to end with, do you regret it? Would you do it again? It's obviously changed your lives publishing this book. So Heather, do you want to start, and then Michele?
I would like to give a really resounding, clear-cut, no, I don't regret it answer to that. It's far more complicated than that. Of course, I don't regret it in the way that I feel as if I've walked through the back of the wardrobe in Narnia and gone into a world, a surreal world, where, fact has become fiction and fiction has become fact. And once I've seen it, I can't unsee it. So I have to keep going with it. I think what is happening to children is absolutely appalling. So ethically, I can't move away from it now. And of course, in relation to what's happening to the position of women and women's bodies and so on, I think we'll talk about later. But it's a double-edged sword. Personally, it puts me at odds with people who would perhaps be part of without me having realised it before, my liberal, educated bubble that I was in. And so I'm I look at Labour MPs, women MPs, the Women's Equality Party, etc., these organisations that don't defend women, don't stand up for children. And it's a continual shock. I still feel it as a shock. But
what about you, Michele? Do you?
Well, the consequences for me have been harrowing. The 2019 campaign, the investigation that went with that, but for me, thankfully, my publisher stood with me. But as a consequence of that, I think my career in 4 UK universities has been demolished, as those universities have colluded with silencing and oppression. And this made me very fearful. My mental health really suffered for quite a while, and I needed my friends and allies very much during that period of trying to recover. I bravely go around saying that I will not trade my silence for survival. And I think that makes me sound a bit braver than I actually am. But I've decided, for the same reasons as Heather, the ethical issues and the safety of the bodies and minds of our children are too precious to compromise by thinking about my own position there. But it's dark out there. And it's still dark if we look at what's happening in Scotland right now. It's still not just in the academy, but in our own front rooms. And my thoughts for other writers coming into this, other commentators, are to work collectively, have someone to watch your back, because I'm very fortunate in my relationship with Heather that I always felt somebody had my back, but not just Heather, everybody who contributed to both books and stood by me more broadly. Without our collective resistance and solidarity, this would be a very different thing. So I would really urge everybody to take that seriously.
And we all want to thank you for having those principles, being the first to put your heads above the parapet, put these books out. And if you haven't read these yet, I really urge you to read them. They're, the first one and the second one, there's so much in these books, and I think they were world changing. And this is Heather's other book, which I also really recommend, Transgender Body Politics, which was published, I think, in 2020? 20, yeah. And I'm really honoured that you came to do this today. I'm really thrilled that you've supported me right from the start. I think sometimes people forget what you've done and what you've contributed, and people don't really know the impact that this has been on both of your lives, and how much courage you've had to keep going and to not be silenced. And I'm really thrilled that we've become great friends through this, and I really, really appreciate that, because I would reiterate what you say, Michele. You need people around you that support you, that have your back. And then it makes it easier to stick to your principles, as you both have done. So thank you so much for coming on today. I think you've probably told a lot of people things they don't know. It's just, we're all very grateful to you for being the pioneers.